They said the orphan was cursed until the rain fell only where he prayed. Chapter 1. The Boy of Droughts. The sun, hanging over Dry Hope, looked like a melted copper coin, burning the earth with a cruelty only the wasteland knows. It had been 7 years since rain had abandoned that forgotten piece of the West. 7 years since the river dried up and the crops turned to dust. The people of the village learned to survive on wells that went deeper and deeper, while their hopes grew shallower and shallower. It was in this scenery of desolation that the boy appeared. Nobody knew where he came from. He was simply there one morning, sitting at the door of the abandoned church, his dark eyes too large for his thin face, his skin burned by the sun like old leather. He looked about 8 years old, maybe younger. Hunger has a way of aging children before their time. Father Miguel, the only man of faith who had remained in the village when all the others fled to more generous lands, was the one who found him first. The old priest, with his 70 years carried on his back like bags of sand, looked at the boy and felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, more disturbing. It was as if those childish eyes held secrets that no child should know. "What's your name, son?" asked the priest with the hoarse voice of someone who no longer preached to anyone but empty walls. The boy didn't answer immediately. His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. Finally, with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere distant, he whispered, "Samuel, my name is Samuel, and your parents, your family, dead in the drought. I'm the only one left." It was a story far too common in those times. Entire families disappeared when the water ran out, swallowed by the implacable desert, or leaving in search of a better life they rarely found. Father Miguel nodded, recognizing the familiar pain in the boy's eyes, and took him inside the church. This would be his home now, a one-person orphanage run by a priest who was beginning to doubt whether God still looked at that corner of the world. The following days established a strange routine. Samuel didn't talk much. He spent hours kneeling in the front pew of the church, hands clasped in silent prayer. Father Miguel, who had seen many faithful in his long life, had never witnessed such devotion in a child. There was something almost disturbing in the intensity of that faith, as if the boy wasn't just praying, but negotiating, bargaining with forces the old priest preferred not to consider. The village's distrust began in the first week. Donna Carmela, the midwife who had brought half the children of Dry Hope into the world, was the first to say out loud what others whispered. "That boy isn't natural. Did you see his eyes? There's something wrong with him. He brings bad luck. You can be sure of it." "He's just a scared child," defended Father Miguel, but even he felt the unease growing in his chest. Because there were things about Samuel that didn't make sense. The boy never sweated, even under the scorching sun. His bare feet walked on hot sand without burning. And there were moments when he thought no one was watching, when his eyes shone with a light that wasn't a reflection. The real change began in the 3rd week. Samuel had developed the habit of walking to the cemetery every afternoon, where he knelt among the rotted wooden crosses and prayed for hours. Father Miguel followed him once, hidden behind an old cactus, watching. The boy didn't just pray, he conversed. He moved his lips in silent dialogue with someone or something the priest couldn't see. And then, on the 4th afternoon, something impossible happened. While Samuel prayed, kneeling on the dry earth among the forgotten graves, a single drop of water fell from the cloudless sky. Within minutes, a light but steady rain was falling, but only over the cemetery, not beyond its boundaries. It was as if an invisible line marked where the water from heaven could and could not touch. Father Miguel fell to his knees, heart pounding in his chest. He watched as the impossible rain wet the ground around Samuel, who continued praying as if nothing extraordinary was happening. The old priest felt tears running down his face, mixing with the raindrops that now reached where he was hiding. They weren't tears of joy. They were tears of reverent fear. because Father Miguel had spent 50 years serving God and had never witnessed a miracle. And now, confronted with one, he didn't know whether to worship or flee. When Samuel finally finished his prayers and returned to the church, his steps left wet footprints in the dry earth. He found Father Miguel sitting in the last pew, his face white as chalk. The boy tilted his head, studying the older man with those disturbing eyes. "You saw," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. "I saw." "But how? Why?" Samuel sat beside the priest, suddenly seeming even younger and more vulnerable. "When I pray, he listens to me. He always has, since I can remember. My mother said it was because I was born during a storm, on the only day of rain in 10 years. She said I was marked, special. But when the drought came back and I prayed for it to stop, when I prayed for the water to return to save my family, nothing happened. They died one by one. Thirst, hunger, fever. And I remained alive, kept praying. But he didn't listen to me, not when it really mattered." The boy's voice broke, and for the first time Father Miguel saw not a mystical prodigy, but a broken child. "Why now?" the priest asked gently. "Why does the rain come now when your family is gone?" Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Because now I'm not praying for myself. I'm praying for the dead, for those who left without water, without dignity, buried in dry, hard ground. I'm asking that their souls finally rest in wet soil, and for some reason that prayer he hears." That night Father Miguel didn't sleep. Lying in his narrow bed in the church annex, he contemplated the cracked ceiling and wondered what kind of God answered prayers for the dead but ignored pleas for the living. What kind of mercy was that? And what purpose could he have for placing such power in the hands of a child who had already lost everything? The next morning, the news spread through the village like fire in dry brush. Carmela had seen the wet footprints. Her son had confirmed that it had rained in the cemetery, only in the cemetery, and now everyone wanted to see the miraculous boy, or expel him. Opinions were divided. Don Augusto, the richest rancher in the village, a man who had seen his fortune evaporate along with his water, arrived at the church with 5 of his men. "I want to see the boy," he demanded, pushing Father Miguel aside. "I want him to make it rain on my lands. If he can make it rain in the cemetery, he can make it rain anywhere." "It doesn't work that way," Samuel replied, appearing from the sacristy. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "I can't control where or when. I can only pray. And he decides whether to listen or not. Then pray for my lands, boy. Pray now." Samuel looked at the rancher with an expression that was too old for his young face. "If I pray for your lands, Mr. Augusto, it will be because I want the land to be blessed, not because you command it. God doesn't answer to orders, neither do I." The tension in the church was palpable. Augusto's men moved their hands to their weapons, but something in the boy's presence made them hesitate. There was an authority there that didn't come from physical strength, but from something more primordial. Finally, Augusto spat on the ground and left, but not before casting a poisoned look at Samuel. "This isn't over, boy. This village has no place for witchcraft." When they were alone again, Father Miguel sat heavily. "You've made a powerful enemy, Samuel. Augusto controls most of the water that's left. He can make our lives very difficult." Samuel just nodded. "I know. But I can't use what was given to me to serve greedy men. That would be betraying the purpose. That would be tainting the gift." "And what is the purpose?" asked the priest. "Why were you chosen, Samuel? What are you expected to do?" The boy looked out the church window toward the cemetery in the distance where the earth was still wet. "I think it's to remind people that God hasn't abandoned this place, that there are still miracles, even if they're not the miracles we want, that sometimes the answer isn't to save the living, but to honor the dead, and that faith, true faith, isn't about getting what we want, it's about accepting what we receive and finding meaning in it." That afternoon, As the sun continued its daily torture over Dry Hope, Samuel returned to the cemetery, and once more, against all laws of nature, the rain fell, only there, only where he prayed. And as the village people watched from outside that impossible circle of blessing, some with admiration, others with fear, others with envy, a truth began to crystallize. The orphan wasn't cursed. He was blessed with a grace that nobody understood, and that incomprehension, as always in human history, was more dangerous than any drought, because it's easy to accept miracles when they serve us. But when they serve a purpose we don't understand, when they challenge our logic and our expectations, miracles become threats. And threats, in the Old West, where survival was already a daily struggle, were eliminated. Father Miguel watched the boy praying under the impossible rain and knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that terrible trials were coming. Samuel had brought hope to Dry Hope, but he had also brought something more dangerous. He had brought change. And change, in that place forgotten by God and time, was the most feared thing of all. Chapter 2. The Thirst of Greed. The rain in the cemetery became a daily event. Always at the same hour, when the sun began its bloody descent on the horizon, Samuel walked among the graves and knelt, and without fail, water fell from the clear sky, wetting only that sacred piece of land. Grass began to grow between the crosses. Wildflowers sprouted where before there were only thorns and desolation. The cemetery of Dry Hope, ironically, became the only living place in the village. People began to come. First just one or two, keeping respectful distance from the circle of rain, watching the orphan boy with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Then more came. Entire families made daily pilgrimages to witness the impossible. Some brought flowers to place on the graves of their loved ones. Others brought empty bottles trying to capture the miraculous water, believing it possessed healing powers. Father Miguel watched everything with growing concern. He saw how people's eyes changed when they looked at Samuel. He was no longer an orphan to be ignored or ridiculed. He was something different, something dangerous, an object of veneration and terror in equal measure. Donna Carmela was the most vocal in her opposition. She gathered a small group of women in the village square, their voices laden with indignation and fear. "This is the devil's work," she declared, pointing a gnarled finger toward the church. "That boy is not of God. No child should have such power. It's unnatural. It's blasphemous." Others agreed, their heads bobbing like chickens in a coop. One suggested that Samuel should be expelled from the village before his presence brought an even worse curse upon them. Another, more extreme, whispered that perhaps more permanent measures were necessary. After all, she argued with twisted logic, if the boy could make it rain in the cemetery, who's to say he couldn't make the drought worse in other places? But not everyone shared this view. Maria, a young widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to the drought, saw Samuel with different eyes. For her, the rain in the cemetery wasn't a curse, it was consolation. For the first time in years, she could visit her family's graves without choking on dust. She could see green grass growing over the mounds where her babies rested. It was the closest thing to peace she had felt since they died. She began bringing Samuel food, simple things like bread and dried meat, leaving them at the church door when she knew the boy would find them. Father Miguel noticed and said nothing. He understood that in the midst of all the fear and suspicion, there needed to be at least one person who saw the child for what he truly was, a lonely, grieving boy carrying a burden too heavy for his small shoulders. Don Augusto, meanwhile, was not a man to forget a perceived insult. He spent 3 days brooding in his dried-up ranch house, drinking whiskey and plotting. On the 4th day, he rode into town with a new plan. If the boy wouldn't cooperate willingly, perhaps he could be persuaded through other means. He found Father Miguel sweeping the church steps. "Where's the witch boy?" Augusto demanded, not bothering to dismount. "He has a name," the priest replied calmly. "Samuel. And he's praying in the cemetery, as he does every afternoon." "Good," I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse." Father Miguel felt ice in his veins. "What kind of offer?" Augusto's smile was cruel. "I'm going to take him to my ranch. He'll live there, in comfort. He'll have food, a real bed, everything a boy could want. And in return, he'll pray for rain on my lands, every day, until the water comes back. And if he refuses, then I'll make sure this village understands that harboring a witch brings consequences. I control the last 3 functioning wells in Dry Hope, Father. People need water more than they need miracles they can't drink." The threat was clear. Cooperate or watch the village die of thirst. Father Miguel wanted to argue, to fight, but he knew Augusto held all the power. The rancher owned not just the wells, but most of the land around Dry Hope. He could make life impossible for anyone who opposed him. That evening, Father Miguel found Samuel sitting on the church steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of copper and blood. The priest sat beside him, suddenly feeling every one of his 70 years. "Samuel, we need to talk about Don Augusto." "I know what he wants," the boy said quietly. "He wants to own my prayers. He wants to treat God like a business transaction. He's threatening the village, threatening to cut off the water supply if you don't cooperate." Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "Father, do you believe in me? Do you believe my gift is from God?" "I do," Miguel answered truthfully. "I've seen things in my life, but never anything like what you can do. It's beyond nature, beyond explanation. It has to be divine." "Then you know I can't use it for evil. I can't let a greedy man corrupt what was given to me for a sacred purpose, even if it means the village suffers." The priest felt tears prickling his eyes. "You're asking people to die of thirst rather than compromise your principles." Samuel turned to look at him, and in those young eyes, Father Miguel saw an ancient wisdom. "I'm not asking anything. I'm simply being true to what I am. But Father, there's something you need to understand. The rain that falls in the cemetery, it's not just for the dead. The ground is getting wet. The water is seeping down. In time, it will reach the aquifer beneath. The water table will rise, not quickly, but steadily. What looks like a small, useless miracle is actually the beginning of salvation, but only if I'm allowed to continue, only if people have faith." "How long until the water reaches the wells?" Samuel closed his eyes, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. 6 months, maybe less. The earth beneath us is thirstier than we know. It drinks deep when it finally gets the chance." 6 months, Father Miguel repeated. "Can the village last that long?" "That depends," Samuel said, standing up. "It depends on whether they choose to trust or to take, whether they choose faith or fear." The next day, Don Augusto returned with 10 armed men. He found Samuel in the cemetery, as expected, kneeling in the center of the rain circle. The water fell around him like a curtain of diamonds in the afternoon sun. "Come with me, boy," Augusto commanded. "I'm taking you to my ranch. You'll be treated well if you cooperate." Samuel didn't move, didn't even look up from his prayers. "No, it wasn't a request," Augusto growled, dismounting. His men spread out, forming a semicircle around the cemetery entrance. "I know," Samuel replied, still praying, "but my answer is still no. I don't belong to you. This gift doesn't belong to you. And I won't be moved." Augusto stepped forward, intending to grab the boy by the collar, but as his boot crossed the invisible line where the rain began, something strange happened. The water that fell on him wasn't cool and refreshing. It was scalding hot, like drops of molten metal. He jumped back with a cry of pain, staring at his hand, where the skin was already reddening. "What sorcery is this?" he shouted. Samuel finally looked up, his face calm but his eyes blazing with an inner fire. "This is sacred ground. The rain falls here to honor the dead and heal the earth. Anyone who enters with greed in their heart, with violence in their intentions, will find only pain. This isn't my doing, Mr. Augusto. This is God's judgment on those who would defile his blessing. The men muttered nervously among themselves. Even in the lawless West, even among hard men used to violence, there were lines that couldn't be crossed. And was sacred ground. And what they had just witnessed was beyond any trick or illusion. Augusto, his pride wounded more than his hand, spat in Samuel's direction. The spittle evaporated before it hit the ground. "You'll regret this, boy, you and that priest. I'll see this whole village dried up and dead before I let a child make a fool of me." He remounted and rode off, his men following. But everyone knew it wasn't over. In the Old West, men like Augusto didn't forgive humiliation. They retaliated. That night, as Samuel lay in his small cot in the church annex, he heard a soft knock at the window. It was Maria, the young widow. She had climbed up with a basket of food, and a warning whispered urgently through the glass. "Augusto is planning something terrible. I heard his men talking in the cantina. They're going to poison the village wells and blame it on you. They'll say your witchcraft has cursed the water. People will turn against you out of fear and desperation." Samuel sat up, processing this information. "Thank you for warning me, but don't worry. What's meant to happen will happen. The Lord protects those who serve him faithfully." Maria shook her head. "You're just a child. You shouldn't have to carry this burden. Let me help you. There are others in the village who believe in you. We can stand together." The boy smiled, a sad, ancient smile. "You're already helping by bringing me food and by caring. But this battle isn't one that can be won with numbers or force. It's a battle of faith against fear, and faith always requires sacrifice." 3 days later, the first well turned foul. The water came up brown and reeking, undrinkable. Augusto's men spread the rumor quickly. The witch boy had cursed it. By nightfall, an angry mob had gathered outside the church, torches in hand, shouting for Samuel to be expelled or worse. Father Miguel stood on the church steps, arms spread wide, trying to calm the crowd. "This is madness. Samuel has done nothing but pray. The well was poisoned by human hands, not divine curse, but fear is a powerful force, stronger than reason." The crowd surged forward, and in that moment, as violence seemed inevitable, Samuel appeared at the church door. He walked past Father Miguel, down the steps, and stood before the mob, a child facing down a storm of adult rage. "If you want someone to blame, blame me," he said, his young voice somehow carrying over the angry shouts. "If you want someone to suffer, let it be me. But know this, hurting me won't bring back the water. Driving me away won't end the drought. The only thing that will save this village is patience and faith. The rain in the cemetery is seeping into the ground. In time, it will refill the aquifer. In time, the wells will run clean again. But only if you wait, only if you trust." Subscribe to our channel to find out what happens to Samuel and whether the village chooses faith over fear. Will Don Augusto's scheme succeed, or will the orphan's impossible gift finally bring salvation to dry hope? The next chapter reveals the ultimate test of belief in a land where water is worth more than gold. Chapter 3. Where faith and water meet. The standoff lasted through the night. The mob, torches burning low, remained outside the church, while Samuel sat on the steps, alone and unmoving. Father Miguel had tried to stay with him, but the boy had insisted the priest rest. "Someone needs to be strong for tomorrow," Samuel had said with that eerie wisdom that made him seem far older than his years. As dawn broke over dry hope, painting the desert sky in shades of rose and amber, something extraordinary happened. Maria was the first to notice. She had been awake all night, watching from her window, praying for the boy's safety. When she went to draw water from her small personal well, just a trickle she'd been rationing for weeks, she found it fuller than it had been in months. And the water was clear, cold, and sweet. She ran through the streets, her voice breaking the uneasy morning silence. "The water, my well. It's rising. It's clean." Others rushed to check their own wells. Not all had refilled, but several of the deeper ones showed new water, and this water was different from what Augusto's men had poisoned. It was pure. It tasted like hope. The crowd that had been so angry the night before now looked at Samuel with confusion and growing wonder. The boy hadn't moved from the church steps. His eyes were closed, lips moving in silent prayer, and around him, though the sun was fully risen, a light mist hung in the air like a blessing. Don Augusto arrived on horseback, his face purple with rage. This proved nothing. Some wells always have water. It doesn't mean the witch boy is responsible. But even his own men were looking doubtful. One of them, a ranch hand named Pedro, who had lost his wife to the drought 2 years ago, stepped forward. "Boss, my family's old well. It's been dry for 5 years, bone dry. I checked it this morning. There's water. Not much, but it's there. And it's rising. I can hear it." Augusto wheeled his horse around, staring at his employee. "You're lying. You're all conspiring against me." "No, sir," Pedro said quietly. "I'm just telling the truth. Maybe we've been wrong about the boy. Maybe we've been so thirsty for a miracle we want to control that we couldn't see the miracle God was actually giving us." The rancher's hand went to his gun. "Are you defying me, Pedro?" "I'm choosing faith over fear," the ranch hand replied. "And if that means you shoot me, then I'll die knowing I finally made the right choice." The tension was unbearable. Father Miguel held his breath. Samuel opened his eyes, looking directly at Augusto. The boy stood slowly, walked down the steps, and moved through the crowd until he stood directly in front of the mounted rancher. "Mr. Augusto," Samuel said, his voice clear and strong, "you're not my enemy. Fear is the enemy. Greed is the enemy. You've spent so long trying to control water, to own it, to profit from others' thirst, that you've forgotten water is a gift. It belongs to everyone. It flows where it's needed, not where it's commanded." Augusto's hand trembled on his gun. "You're just a child. What do you know about survival, about hard choices?" "I know about loss," Samuel replied. "I watched my family die. I prayed for rain and got silence. I begged God to save them and heard nothing. So yes, I know about hard choices. I know about suffering, but I also learned something you haven't. Sometimes the answer we want isn't the answer we need. Sometimes God's plan is bigger than our pain. Shoot me if you want. Drive me out. It won't matter. The water is coming back, not because I commanded it, but because I prayed for the earth itself to be healed. And the earth listened, not quickly, not dramatically, but truly. The rain in the cemetery has been feeding the ground for 3 months. The aquifer is rising. In another 3 months, every well in Dry Hope will run clear. That's not my miracle. That's God's patience teaching us our own." The gun slipped from Augusto's hand, falling to the dirt. The rancher looked suddenly old, defeated. "And what about me? What about all I've built, all I've fought for?" "You can join us," Father Miguel said, stepping forward. "You can stop fighting against the blessing and start accepting it. Your wells will fill too, Don Augusto, but only if you stop poisoning them, only if you let go of your need to control everything." For a long moment, the rancher sat motionless on his horse. Then, slowly, he dismounted. He looked at Samuel with eyes that had finally seen past their own reflection. "I've been a fool," he said quietly. "A proud, stubborn fool. Can you forgive me, boy?" Samuel smiled, and it was the first truly childlike expression anyone had seen on his face. "It's not my forgiveness you need, Mr. Augusto. But I think the water will forgive you. The earth will forgive you. That's what it does. It receives and gives in an endless cycle. All we have to do is stop interrupting it." That day marked the true turning point for Dry Hope. Over the following weeks, more wells began to refill. The water rose slowly but steadily, exactly as Samuel had predicted. The cemetery continued to receive its daily rain. And now people came not just to witness the miracle, but to tend to the graves, to plant more flowers, to transform that place of death into a garden of remembrance. Don Augusto underwent his own transformation. He opened his private wells to the community, charging nothing. He used his wealth to help repair the damage his greed had caused. It wasn't redemption, not completely, but it was a start. And in the harsh lands of the West, a start was sometimes the best anyone could hope for. Maria became Samuel's closest friend and protector. She made sure he ate regularly, that he had clean clothes, that someone checked on him when he spent too many hours in prayer. In return, Samuel helped her heal from her losses, reminding her that grief and gratitude could coexist, that remembering the dead didn't mean abandoning life. Father Miguel watched it all with a heart full of complex emotions. He had witnessed a genuine miracle, but more than that, he had witnessed a community transformed, not by supernatural power alone, but by the courage of one strange child who refused to compromise his principles even when threatened with death. 6 months after Samuel first appeared in Dry Hope, the last dry well in the village began producing water. It happened on a Sunday morning, and the entire population gathered in the town square to see it. When the bucket came up full of clear, cold water, people wept, they embraced, they danced, and then, led by Father Miguel, they marched to the church to give thanks. Samuel was, as usual, in the cemetery. But on this day, something was different. As he knelt in prayer, the rain that fell around him began to spread. Slowly at first, then faster, the invisible boundary expanded. The rain moved beyond the cemetery, into the streets, across the fields, over the entire village. It was the first real rain Dry Hope had seen in 7 years. People stood in the streets, faces turned upward, mouths open to catch the drops. Children who had never experienced rain laughed and splashed in the growing puddles. Adults cried tears that mixed with the water falling from heaven, and through it all, Samuel remained kneeling, his prayer finally complete. When the rain stopped 3 hours later, Dry Hope was transformed. The streets were rivers of mud, the dust had been washed away, and in the distance, for the first time in years, the dried riverbed began to show the first trickle of returning water. Father Miguel found Samuel sitting on the church steps, exhausted but peaceful. "Is it finished?" the priest asked. "Is your mission complete?" Samuel nodded slowly. "The water has returned to its natural cycle. The drought is broken. The earth remembers how to receive and give again. I'm not needed anymore. But you'll stay, won't you? You've become part of this community. These people love you." The boy smiled sadly, for a while. "But there are other places like this one, other forgotten corners of the West where the land is dying and faith is drowning. I think I'm meant to wander, Father, to go where the thirst is greatest and remind people that God hasn't abandoned them, that miracles still happen, even if they're not the miracles we expect." Father Miguel felt his heart breaking. "You're just a child. You deserve a home, a family, a normal life." "I had a family," Samuel said quietly, "and I lost them. But maybe that loss was preparing me for this. Maybe every prayer that went unanswered was teaching me to pray differently, to ask not for what I want, but for what's truly needed. And what the world needs isn't more people demanding miracles. It needs more people willing to be the answer to someone else's prayer." 3 days later, Samuel left Dry Hope. He walked out at dawn, carrying nothing but a small bundle of food that Maria had prepared. The entire village came out to say goodbye. Even Don Augusto, tears streaming down his weathered face, knelt before the boy and asked for a final blessing. Samuel placed his small hand on the rancher's head. "The blessing isn't mine to give, but I'll pray that the water keeps flowing, that the crops grow, that this village prospers and remembers that all good things are gifts, not possessions. That's all any of us can do." As Samuel walked into the rising sun, Father Miguel watched until the boy became just a speck on the horizon, then vanished entirely. The priest felt empty, but also strangely hopeful. because he knew that somewhere out there another dying village would wake up to find a strange child at their church door. Another cemetery would bloom with impossible rain. Another community would learn that faith wasn't about commanding miracles, but about recognizing them when they came in unexpected forms. Years later, stories began to circulate throughout the Western Territories. Tales of an orphan boy who appeared in desperate places, who prayed in graveyards, who made rain fall where only dust had been. Some said he was an angel, others called him a witch, but those who had actually met him knew the truth. He was simply Samuel, a child who had lost everything, and in that loss had found a purpose greater than himself. A boy who understood that the greatest miracle wasn't changing the world to suit our desires, but changing our hearts to accept the world's wisdom. Dry hope prospered. The river flowed again. Crops grew. Children were born who would never know the desperation of the 7-year drought. And in the cemetery, where green grass now grew thick and wildflowers bloomed year-round, a single wooden cross stood taller than the others. It bore no name, only an inscription that Father Miguel had carved with his own hands. Here the rain first fell. Here faith conquered fear. Here a child taught us that miracles aren't about getting what we want, but about wanting what we receive. And on certain evenings, when the sun set and the shadows grew long, some claimed they could still hear the sound of a child's voice in prayer. Not asking, not demanding, just conversing quietly with the divine in that sacred space where faith and water meet. Thank you for joining us on Samuel's journey through the harsh lands where miracles and faith collide. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Old West, where the line between the natural and supernatural blurs in the desert heat. Every story we share reminds us that the most powerful forces aren't always the loudest, and that sometimes the smallest among us carry the greatest truth. Don't miss our upcoming narratives exploring the forgotten corners of the frontier where hope refuses to die.